Ever see a headline claiming a 27% higher risk of disease? Sounds terrifying until you realize it's just a math trick designed to scare you. Today, I'll reveal how these risk numbers are manipulated and what the real truth means for your health. Hey, everybody, my name is Mark Bates. I'm a metabolic health coach, and this is my video on deconstructing medical misinformation, the hidden dangers of statistical manipulation. So let's get into it. Let's start with medical headlines are designed to hide the mathematical tricks that they use to actually fool you. Okay, so headlines screaming about 20% higher risk of heart disease from skipping breakfast sent millions of people scrambling to change their morning routines. The mathematical reality tells a different story. If 100 men who eat breakfast regularly develop coronary heart disease, then 127 men who skip breakfast might develop the condition. The relative risk sounds alarming, but the absolute difference remains modest. This statistical sleight of hand represents one of the most pervasive problems in medical communications today. Right? So let's talk about this. There's a red flag hidden in plain sight. When medical headlines trumpet percentage increases without providing baseline context, they create what amounts to statistical theater. A 25% increased risk sounds terrifying until you discover that it might actually only represent a change from 0.1% to 0.125% absolute risk. The difference becomes practically meaningless. Yet people might make significant lifestyle changes based on these exaggerated perceptions of risk. The breakfast example we just talked about illustrates how relative risk reporting without absolute context can mislead individuals into health decisions driven by manufactured fear rather than meaningful evidence. Research from Cancer Research UK demonstrates this manipulation perfectly. After the Fukushima nuclear disaster, right? Headlines were screaming about a 70% increase in cancer rates. Oh my god, that sounds terrible. But the absolute risk, it changed from 0.77% to 1.29%. Yeah, there was a change there, obviously, from all the radiation. But what's the risk of you actually getting cancer from it? Especially if you're not living in Fukushima. A tiny 0.5% percentage point can increase transformed into alarming headlines that influence public perception and policy decision making. There's a systematic machine behind all the statistical distortion. The pattern emerges from a web of incentives that rewards dramatic findings over statistical honesty. Researchers face pressure to produce significant, impactful results that attract citations and funding. Relative risk figures, which can appear as a large percentage, make findings sound much more newsworthy and dramatic. Journalists operate under similar pressures. Attention-grabbing headlines drive readership, and relative risk provides dramatic numbers that capture public attention. Many journalists and even some researchers lack complete understanding of the distinction between relative and absolute risk, leading to unintentional misreporting that compounds the problem. The simplification seems logical. Presenting relative risk appears more straightforward than explaining absolute risk, which requires nuanced communication about baseline probabilities and real-world significance. But this simplification creates misleading impressions that can influence health decisions, policy formation, and public understanding of medical research. Analysis of medical trials published in top journals reveals that 44% of positive studies report only relative risk measures in their abstracts without providing absolute risk context. So there's a foundational problem here in evidence-based medicine. When researchers themselves cannot properly interpret their findings, the entire foundation of evidence based medicine becomes questionable. Misunderstandings of risk statistics compromises the accuracy and clarity of data that forms the basis for clinical decisions. This leads to misleading conclusions about treatment effectiveness and potential harms. Financial conflicts of interest, publication bias, and pressures to produce significant results create an environment that encourages relative risk reporting even when absolute benefits remain minimal. This environment fosters a default to prescribed culture where treatments get recommended broadly, sometimes without clear evidence of meaningful benefit, potentially exposing patients to unnecessary risks. Clinicians may overestimate treatment benefits due to misunderstanding risk statistics, leading to informed consent issues and suboptimal patient decisions. Guidelines based on distorted evidence can become outdated or overly broad, reducing their clinical utility and potentially causing harm. Right? And don't disregard the marketing machine that amplifies the problem. Pharmaceutical companies capitalize on statistical confusion through strategic marketing that emphasizes benefits in relative terms while downplaying risks in absolute terms. This creates a lopsided information environment where drug benefits appear magnified while risks seem minimal, potentially influencing prescribing decisions and patient choices. Research on prescription drug advertising reveals that only 33% of major claims contain truthful information, right? While 66% included false or potentially misleading statements. Consumers may see up to 30 hours of drug advertising annually. This represents twice the time they spend with their primary care physicians. The FDA's analysis of regulatory violations found that the most common infractions involved omissions or minimizations of risk information, overstatements of efficacy, and substantiated claims. Right? So, is there a path forward? And there is, but it requires systematic change. The single most impactful change would mandate transparent reporting of absolute risk alongside relative risk in all clinical trials, research publications, and medical communications. This transparency would prevent the common practice of highlighting only the relative risk, which often exaggerates perceived benefits or harms of interventions. Providing absolute risk allows clinicians, patients, and policymakers to understand real world impact and make informed decisions based on meaningful data. But implementation faces significant challenges. Medical journals, pharmaceutical companies, and researchers all maintain financial and reputational incentives to preserve the current system. And as I always say, follow the money. Sensational findings and dramatic results drive profits, prestige, and funding. These incentives create strong motivation to circumvent or superficially comply with transparency requirements. Independent oversight and enforcement become essential. Regulatory agencies and independent bodies must enforce transparency standards with audits, penalties, and public accountability to deter noncompliance. But right now, with the current system, that doesn't disregard the fact that you have personal responsibility in an imperfect system. While waiting for systematic change, individuals bear some responsibility for accurately interpreting and conveying statistical information. This involves actively challenging misleading narratives in medical research and media, right? Calling out statistical distortions and educating others to foster critical thinking, right? Personal integrity requires continuous learning and humility, recognizing the limits of knowledge and remaining open to revising interpretations as new evidence emerges. Okay? The line between complicity and pragmatism requires careful navigation. Complicity occurs when accepting or disseminating distorted statistics without scrutiny, thereby perpetuating misinformation and undermining public trust. Pragmatism involves working within existing systems to improve communication and understanding, even when systematic change remains slow or incomplete. And finally, some practical protection against statistical manipulation you can take on. Consumers can protect themselves by developing some statistical literacy and applying consistent evaluation criteria to hear information, right? Just because you hear it on an ad, don't accept it as being the gospel truth. When encountering relative risk claims and anything says an increase of risk, right, or a reduction in risk by a certain percentage, that's a relative risk claim. Always seek absolute risk data. Ask what the baseline probability is and how much the absolute risk actually changes. Okay? Keep that in mind. Anytime your doctor is pressured to prescribe something to you that has a very high relative risk factor, is that really something that applies to you? Look for information about the number needed to treat. And that's a number you can get online very easily. Just ask for what is the actual number needed to treat to get a good outcome for this drug, right? These measures provide clearer understanding of real world impact than relative percentages. Consider the source and potential conflicts of interest. Research funded by companies with financial stakes and outcomes requires extra scrutiny. Obviously, follow the money again. Seek multiple sources and look for independent replication of findings before making significant health decisions based on single studies. Question dramatic headlines and look for underlying research. Often the actual study shows much more modest effects than media reporting suggests. The foundation of evidence-based medicine depends on high-quality, transparent, and interpretable data. When that foundation becomes compromised by statistical manipulation, the entire system suffers. Protecting public health requires both systematic reform and individual vigilance in interpreting and communicating risk information. And finally, the mathematical reality behind health headlines often tells a very different story than the dramatic percentages suggest. Understanding this difference empowers better decisions and helps restore trust in medical research. All right. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the appropriate section. And we're building a community here to try and help you get answers. If there's something you want me to cover in a video, let me know so we can do the research for you and get it to you. We're here to help you. And as always, once again, if you haven't done so, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with a friend. All this stuff helps the channel a great deal. I thank you for that help. And as always, you're helping a bunch of other people. So have a great day.